At 24 years old, he was the youngest actor ever nominated for a Best Actor Oscar. Saturday Night Fever and Grease raked in over $600 million and transformed the world. Today, at 71, he lives isolated in a Florida mansion, talking to photographs of people who will never answer back. There's a man who made the entire planet dance, who rose from the dead when Hollywood had already dug his grave, who starred in one of the greatest comebacks in cinema history. But behind that smile that lit up generations, there's a pain so deep that not even fame could protect him from it. Because what happens when you conquer the world at 24, lose everything at 30, come back triumphant at 40, but then life rips away the only things that truly mattered? What's left when you've buried your son, said goodbye to your wife, and discovered that Hollywood doesn't resurrect anyone twice? How did a poor kid from New Jersey become the biggest icon of the 70s? Why did the same industry that worshipped him turn him into a punchline just 5 years later? How did Tarantino risk everything to save him when nobody else believed? What happened that January morning in 2009 that destroyed everything? And why, after 5 decades lighting up the world, does John Travolta now live alone, invisible, with only memories of what he can no longer save? But before we understand how it all fell apart, we need to go back in time. Because John Travolta's story doesn't begin in the spotlight. It begins on the streets of Englewood, New Jersey, where a boy from a poor family learned that dreams have a price, and that sometimes that price is everything you love. John Joseph Travolta was born on February 18, 1954, in Englewood, New Jersey, the youngest of 6 children in a working-class family where dreams were spoken in whispers but never abandoned. His father, Salvatore Travolta, a first-generation Italian-American, sold tires for a living, his hands rough from labor, his back bent from years of providing. His mother, Helen Cecilia Burke, an Irish-American actress and high school drama teacher, carried a fire that hard work and motherhood could never extinguish. In the cramped Travolta household, there was little money but endless performance. Helen didn't just teach theater, she lived it. Their living room became a stage. Dinner conversations became rehearsals. Every scraped knee was a scene. Every bedtime story a monologue. While other kids played baseball, young John learned tap routines on the kitchen linoleum. While his father worked double shifts to keep the lights on, his mother filled the house with music, movement, and the intoxicating belief that a boy from Englewood could one day touch the stars. "She made me believe I was special," John would later confess, his voice softening at the memory. "Not because I was talented, because she saw something in me I couldn't yet see in myself." That belief became his oxygen. At 12, he was already performing in local theater productions. At 14, he dropped out of Dwight Morrow High School, a decision that horrified his father, but earned his mother's quiet blessing. "If you're going to do this," she told him, "don't do it halfway." At 16, with $200 borrowed from his sister and a suitcase stuffed with second-hand clothes, John Travolta left New Jersey for New York City. He wasn't running toward fame, he was running toward survival. Broadway didn't welcome him with applause. It greeted him with slammed doors, casting directors who barely looked up, and auditions where he was just another face in a sea of dreamers. He slept on friends' couches. He waited tables at diners where the tips barely covered subway fare. He auditioned dozens of times, hearing no so often it became background noise. "There were nights I cried myself to sleep," he admitted years later, wondering if my mother had been wrong, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. But something in him refused to quit. Maybe it was his mother's voice echoing in his mind. Maybe it was the memory of his father's exhausted face, a reminder that hard work was the only language his family understood. Whatever it was, it kept him moving. Small roles came, tiny cracks in the wall. A touring production of Grease, where he played Duty, not Danny. A commercial here, a callback there. Nothing close to stardom, but just enough to keep hope from dying completely. Then, in 1975, opportunity arrived not as an explosion, but as a phone call. A new TV sitcom needed a charming, cocky Italian kid from Brooklyn. The role was small, almost forgettable. But for John Travolta, it was the door he'd been kicking at for years. The show was called Welcome Back, Kotter. The character was Vinnie Barbarino, and within weeks of the pilot airing, the boy from Englewood, New Jersey, became the name every teenage girl in America was screaming. His mother had been right all along. He was special. But what Helen Travolta could never have warned him about was the cost. Because Hollywood doesn't just give you fame, it takes everything in return. And for John Travolta, the price would be paid not in money, but in heartbreak that would follow him for the rest of his life. Welcome Back. Kotter premiered on September 9, 1975, and John Travolta's life exploded overnight. As Vinnie Barbarino, the dim-witted but irresistibly charming sweat hog, he wasn't just a supporting player. He became the show's heartbeat. Teenage girls plastered his face on bedroom walls. Magazine covers fought for his smile. Within months, the kid who'd been sleeping on couches was signing autographs in mobs so thick that police had to intervene. But television stardom, intoxicating as it was, felt like a cage to John. He didn't want to be a sitcom actor, he wanted to be a movie star. And in 1977, fate handed him the role that would rewrite not just his career, but the entire landscape of American cinema. Saturday Night Fever was never supposed to be a masterpiece. It was a low-budget film about a Brooklyn paint store clerk who escaped his dead-end life through disco dancing. The script was raw, gritty, almost depressing. But director John Badham saw something in Travolta that others had missed. Not just charisma, but hunger. The hunger of a kid from New Jersey who understood what it meant to dream in the dark. John threw himself into the role with terrifying commitment. He trained 6 hours a day with choreographer Danae Terrio, learning moves so precise, so electric, that every step looked effortless. He studied Brooklyn accents until his voice carried the weight of streets he'd never lived on. He starved himself, dropping weight to achieve the lean, hungry look of Tony Manero, a young man desperate to be somebody, anybody, other than invisible. When Saturday Night Fever opened on December 16, 1977, it didn't just succeed. It detonated. The film grossed over $230 million worldwide, a staggering sum for a modestly budgeted drama. The soundtrack, driven by the Bee Gees, became the best-selling album of all time, moving over 40 million copies. And John Travolta, at just 23 years old, became a god. The white suit, the black shirt, the finger pointing toward the heavens on that illuminated dance floor. It became the most iconic image of the 1970s, a symbol of rebellion, youth, and the raw, aching desire to matter. Critics who had dismissed him as a TV pretty boy were silenced. The Academy nominated him for Best Actor, making him the youngest nominee in that category in Oscar history. But John didn't stop. He couldn't. 6 months later, in June 1978, Grease exploded into theaters, and whatever was left of normal life evaporated entirely. Playing Danny Zuko opposite Olivia Newton-John's Sandy, John delivered a performance that somehow balanced danger and sweetness, charm and vulnerability. The film became the highest-grossing musical in history, raking in over $400 million globally. "You're the One That I Want" blasted from every radio. "Summer Nights" became the anthem of a generation. And John Travolta was no longer just a star. He was a cultural phenomenon, a name spoken in the same breath as Elvis, Brando, and Dean. At 24, he had achieved what most actors spend lifetimes chasing. He was untouchable. The world worshipped him. Magazines dubbed him the King of Hollywood. Studios offered blank checks. Directors begged for his time. Everywhere he went, crowds swarmed. Women screamed his name. Men wanted to be him. He was living the dream his mother had planted in his heart as a boy. The dream that seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. But Hollywood, for all its glitter, has a cruel memory. It builds you up with one hand and destroys you with the other. And for John Travolta, standing at the peak of unimaginable success, the fall was coming. Not slowly, but with a violence that would leave him shattered, humiliated, and desperate to remember who he'd been before the lights went out. Because the higher you climb, the further you fall. And John Travolta was about to discover that in Hollywood, immortality is an illusion, and yesterday's king can become tomorrow's punchline faster than a disco beat. The boy from New Jersey had conquered the world. But the world, as he would soon learn, doesn't let you keep what you've won. It only lets you remember what you lost. The 1980s should have been John Travolta's decade of dominance. Instead, it became his decade of destruction. The fall began not with a bang, but with a whisper of doubt, a single misstep that snowballed into a catastrophic avalanche from which he could not escape. In 1978, still riding the tidal wave of Grease's success, John made a choice that would haunt him for years. He accepted a role in Moment by Moment, a romantic drama opposite Lily Tomlin, a woman 15 years his senior. The script was awkward. The chemistry was non-existent. But John believed his name alone could turn anything into gold. He was wrong. When Moment by Moment opened in December 1978, critics didn't just pan it, they savaged it. The New York Times called it embarrassingly amateurish. Variety labeled it a career killer. It bombed so spectacularly at the box office that theaters pulled it after just 2 weeks. For the first time since Welcome Back, Coter, John Travolta, tasted failure. And it was bitter. But worse than the failure was the realization that followed. Hollywood had already begun to turn on him. The same industry that had crowned him king was now sharpening its knives, waiting for the next mistake. And John, desperate to prove he wasn't a one-trick disco dancer, kept giving them ammunition. Urban Cowboy in 1980 offered brief redemption. Playing a Texas oil worker navigating love and mechanical bulls, John reminded audiences why they'd fallen for him in the first place. The film grossed over $53 million and reignited the country music craze. For a moment, it seemed the stumble had been just that, a stumble, not a collapse. But then came 1983, and with it, Staying Alive, the ill-conceived sequel to Saturday Night Fever. Directed by Sylvester Stallone, the film abandoned the gritty realism of the original for a glossy, soulless spectacle that felt more like a music video than a story. Critics destroyed it. Roger Ebert called it a disappointment of stunning proportions. Audiences stayed home. The magic was gone. John followed it with Two of a Kind, reuniting with Olivia Newton-John in a desperate attempt to recapture the Grease lightning. It failed miserably. Then came Perfect in 1985, a drama about aerobics culture that was so tone-deaf it became a punchline. One critic wrote, "Travolta looks lost, like a man searching for the career he used to have. Each failure hit harder than the last. Scripts that once flooded his mailbox dried up. Directors who once begged for his time stopped calling. Offers that remained were humiliating, low-budget schlock, direct-to-video garbage, roles that felt like charity." The boy who'd been nominated for an Oscar at 23 was now, at 32, considered box office poison. He tried everything. He took roles in forgettable thrillers like The Experts. He appeared in talking baby comedies like Look Who's Talking, which ironically became his biggest hit of the late 80s. Not because of him, but because audiences loved the voice of Bruce Willis coming from an infant. John had been reduced to playing second fiddle to a baby. The whispers grew louder. He's finished. He's washed up. He was a fad. Nothing more. Magazine covers that once celebrated him now mocked him. Late-night comedians made him the punchline. The man who had once defined cool had become the symbol of has-been desperation. Financially, he was fine. The earlier successes had made him wealthy. But money couldn't buy back respect. It couldn't erase the sting of walking into auditions and seeing pity in casting directors' eyes. It couldn't silence the voice in his head, whispering the same question over and over. Was my mother wrong? Was I never special at all? By the early 1990s, John Travolta had become Hollywood's ghost. Still alive, still visible, but irrelevant. The Disco King had been dethroned, his white suit packed away, his finger no longer pointing toward heaven, but buried in his pockets as he walked anonymous streets, wondering if the dream had died for good. What he didn't know was that salvation was coming, not from a studio executive or a sentimental director, but from a brash, foul-mouthed genius working in a video store, writing a script that would change everything. In 1993, a 39-year-old John Travolta sat in his Los Angeles home, reading a script unlike anything he'd seen in a decade. It was raw, profane, violent, and structured like a puzzle. The character was Vincent Vega, a heroin-addicted hitman with a philosophical streak and a love for cheeseburgers. It was dark, dangerous, and completely unlike the safe, forgettable roles he'd been taking just to stay visible. The script was called Pulp Fiction, and it was written by a 30-year-old video store clerk turned director named Quentin Tarantino, a motor-mouthed cinephile whose first film, Reservoir Dogs, had become a cult sensation. Tarantino didn't just want John Travolta for Vincent Vega. He worshipped him. "I grew up watching Saturday Night Fever," Tarantino later said. "To me, Travolta wasn't washed up. He was a legend waiting to be rediscovered." But Hollywood didn't share that faith. When Tarantino pitched Travolta to the studio, executives recoiled. "Are you serious?" one asked. "Nobody wants to see John Travolta anymore." Names like Daniel Day-Lewis, Michael Madsen, and even William Hurt were thrown around. But Tarantino refused to budge. "It's Travolta or nobody," he said, risking the entire project. Eventually, the studio relented, offering John the role for a humiliatingly low salary of just $140,000, a fraction of what he'd once commanded. John didn't care about the money. He cared about the chance. "I knew this was it," he admitted later. "If this didn't work, I was done." When Pulp Fiction premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in May 1994, the reaction was volcanic. The film didn't just win the Palme d'Or, it ignited a cultural earthquake. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece. Audiences quoted its lines like scripture. And John Travolta, the forgotten king of disco, was suddenly cool again. The twist dance scene at Jack Rabbit Slim's, where Vincent Vega glides across the floor with Uma Thurman's Mia Wallace, became iconic instantly. It wasn't Saturday Night Fever's athletic perfection. It was loose, playful, imperfect, and somehow that made it even more powerful. John wasn't playing a character, he was reclaiming himself. The film grossed over $210 million worldwide on an $8 million budget and earned 7 Oscar nominations, including Best Actor for John Travolta. At the 1995 Academy Awards, he walked the red carpet not as a relic, but as a resurrection. He didn't win the Oscar. That went to Tom Hanks for Forrest Gump, but it didn't matter. He had already won something more valuable, his career back. Overnight, offers flooded in again. Get Shorty in 1995 earned him a Golden Globe. Face/Off in 1997 grossed $245 million and proved he could anchor a blockbuster. Primary Colors in 1998 showed his dramatic range. A Civil Action reminded audiences he could disappear into a role. John Travolta wasn't just relevant again. He was undeniable. "Quentin saved my life," John said in interviews, his voice cracking with emotion. "He believed in me when no one else did. He didn't see a has-been. He saw Vincent Vega." The resurrection was complete. The man Hollywood had buried came roaring back from the grave, sharper, hungrier, and more appreciated than ever before. For a glorious moment, it seemed like the worst was behind him, that the suffering had been worth it, that the story would end in redemption. But life, as John Travolta would soon discover in the cruelest way imaginable, doesn't trade in happy endings. It trades in heartbreak. And the next chapter of his story would bring a pain so unbearable that even Pulp Fiction's triumph would feel like a distant, hollow dream. On April 13, 1992, John Travolta married actress Kelly Preston in a private ceremony in Paris. It wasn't his first love, but it was his truest. Kelly was warm, grounded, and unimpressed by fame. She saw John not as the disco king or the comeback story, but simply as a man. Together, they built something rare in Hollywood, a family that felt real. Their first child, Jet, was born on April 13, 1992, the same date as their wedding, a detail John always called a gift from the universe. Jet arrived with a full head of dark hair and eyes that sparkled with mischief. John held him in the delivery room and wept, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. After years of career chaos, Jet gave him purpose beyond the screen. But as Jet grew, it became clear something was different. He didn't speak as early as other children. He struggled with eye contact. He had sensitivities to sounds and textures that other kids didn't notice. By age 2, doctors suggested he might be on the autism spectrum. John and Kelly were also told Jet had suffered from Kawasaki disease as an infant, a rare condition that caused inflammation and could lead to seizures. The Travoltas never publicly confirmed an autism diagnosis, a silence that would later fuel controversy tied to their involvement in the Church of Scientology, which historically rejected psychiatric labels. But regardless of the terminology, the reality was undeniable. Jet needed constant care, patience, and a kind of love that demanded everything. John gave it willingly. He rearranged his career around Jet's needs. He turned down roles that required long shoots overseas. He learned to communicate in the unique language Jet understood, through gestures, through routines, through the safe, predictable rhythms that made Jet feel secure. "He taught me what unconditional love really means," John once said softly. "Jet didn't care about my movies or my fame. He just wanted me to be there." And John was. For 16 years, he was there. Every doctor's appointment, every therapy session, every quiet morning when Jet would sit beside him, content in silence. Being Jet's father became the role John was most proud of, the one that mattered more than any Oscar ever could. Then came January 2nd, 2009. The Travolta family was vacationing in the Bahamas, staying at their home in the old Bahama Bay resort. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, sun, ocean, and time together. Jet had seemed fine that morning, happy even. But just after 10 a.m., a nanny found him unconscious in the bathroom. He had suffered a seizure and struck his head on the bathtub. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Jet Travolta was pronounced dead at Rand Memorial Hospital. He was 16 years old. The news broke like a tidal wave across the world. Headlines screamed the tragedy. Fans flooded social media with condolences. But none of the public mourning could touch the private devastation inside John Travolta's soul. He later described those first hours as a blackness I didn't know existed. Kelly collapsed in his arms, inconsolable. Their daughter Ella, only 8 years old, asked questions no child should have to ask. And John, the man who had danced his way through heartbreak before, found himself unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but repeat the same agonizing question. Why wasn't I there? The guilt became a second grief, just as crushing as the loss itself. John replayed that morning endlessly in his mind. If he had checked on Jet 5 minutes earlier, if they had stayed home instead of vacationing, if he had insisted on different treatments, different doctors, different choices. I kept thinking, what kind of father lets this happen? He admitted years later, his voice breaking. Friends described him as a ghost in those months that followed. He went through the motions, attending Jet's funeral, comforting Kelly, holding Ella, but the light had gone out. He stopped flying, even though piloting planes had once been his greatest joy. He stopped reading scripts. He stopped caring about anything that once mattered. Kelly, drowning in her own grief, tried to pull him back. But how do you save someone when you're barely surviving yourself? The marriage strained under the weight of a loss no partnership is designed to carry. They clung to each other not out of strength, but out of desperation. Two people treading water in the same black ocean. John later admitted, "There were days I didn't want to wake up. Not because I wanted to end things, but because waking up meant remembering all over again that Jet was gone." That confession, raw and unguarded, revealed the depth of a pain no red carpet or standing ovation could ever touch. He tried to work. In 2010, he appeared in From Paris with Love, playing a bald, gun-toting spy. It was supposed to be a fun, brainless action romp. But watching him on screen, critics noticed something hollow in his eyes. A man performing a role while his soul remained elsewhere. The film flopped, but John didn't seem to care. How could box office numbers matter when your son's bedroom sat empty? In 2010, Kelly became pregnant again. On November 23rd, she gave birth to Benjamin, a son. For John, it was bittersweet. He loved Benjamin fiercely, but the boy's arrival couldn't erase the absence of Jet. "Benjamin isn't a replacement," John said carefully. "He's a reason to keep going, but Jet will always be missing." The tragedy didn't just shatter John Travolta, it redefined him. He would never again be the carefree dancer, the cocky star, the man who believed triumph could outrun pain. Jet's death carved a scar so deep that every smile afterward carried the shadow of what was lost. And the cruelest part? The suffering wasn't over. Not even close. John Travolta's relationship with the Church of Scientology began in 1975. The same year, Welcome Back, Kotter made him famous. He was 21, overwhelmed by sudden stardom, and searching for meaning in a world that suddenly felt chaotic. Actor Joan Prather handed him a book, Dianetics, by L. Ron Hubbard, and told him it would change his life. She was right, though not in the way anyone could have predicted. For John, Scientology offered structure, discipline, and a community that seemed to understand the pressures of fame. He rose quickly through the ranks, becoming one of the church's most visible and valuable members. Alongside Tom Cruise and Kirstie Alley, John became a poster child for Scientology's success, attending galas, donating millions, and defending the organization fiercely against critics. "Scientology gave me tools to handle life," he said in numerous interviews, his tone almost rehearsed. "It saved me during the hardest times." And for years, his devotion seemed genuine, unshakable, a bedrock in an industry built on sand. But after Jet's death in 2009, that devotion became a lightning rod for controversy. Whispers had swirled for years about Jet's condition. Medical professionals suggested autism. Witnesses described behaviors consistent with seizure disorders. Yet, the Travoltas never publicly confirmed these diagnoses, a silence many attributed to Scientology's well-documented rejection of psychiatry and psychiatric labels. The church's founder, L. Ron Hubbard, had famously called psychiatry an industry of death, and many former members claimed the organization discouraged families from seeking traditional medical or psychological treatment. In the wake of Jet's death, critics pounced. Why hadn't Jet been on seizure medication? Why was he left unmonitored in a bathroom? Was John's faith preventing his son from receiving proper care? Tabloids ran brutal headlines. Online forums exploded with accusations. And John, already shattered by grief, found himself defending not just his choices as a father, but his beliefs as a Scientologist. He never wavered publicly. "My son received the best care possible," he said firmly. "These accusations are cruel and unfounded." But those close to him noticed the toll. The questions haunted him, adding guilt to grief, suspicion to sorrow. Had his faith helped Jet, or had it failed him? The controversies didn't stop there. For decades, rumors about John's sexuality had circulated through Hollywood's back channels. Anonymous sources, tabloid exposés, and alleged encounters painted a picture at odds with his public image as a devoted husband and father. In 2012, two male masseurs filed lawsuits accusing John of sexual assault and harassment during private sessions, claiming he had made inappropriate advances and exposed himself. John vehemently denied the allegations. His lawyers attacked the accusers' credibility. The cases were eventually dropped or settled quietly out of court. But the damage lingered. The lawsuits became fodder for late-night jokes, internet memes, and conspiracy theories suggesting Scientology was helping him suppress the truth. Former Scientology members added fuel to the fire, claiming the church maintained a thick file on John's private life, allegedly using sensitive information to keep him loyal and compliant. "They know everything," one defector claimed in a documentary, "and they'll use it if you try to leave." John never addressed these claims directly. He continued appearing at Scientology events, smiling for cameras, praising the organization. But observers noticed a shift. The effusive praise seemed more mechanical. The sparkle in his eyes dimmed. He looked less like a believer and more like a man trapped, bound by decades of investment, by fear of exposure, by the weight of secrets, real or imagined. The cruel irony was inescapable. John had joined Scientology seeking freedom from the chaos of fame. But now, it seemed to cage him. His marriage, his career, his reputation, all entangled in an organization that offered salvation but demanded total loyalty. Critics called him a prisoner. Defenders called him a true believer. John himself said nothing that wasn't carefully scripted. Behind closed doors, the pressure mounted. Kelly stood by him publicly, but friends whispered about strain. The church's controversies grew louder. Documentaries like Going Clear exposed abuses. Celebrities like Leah Remini defected and spoke out. And through it all, John remained silent and steadfast, a man whose private truth remained locked behind a smile that no longer reached his eyes. The question haunted everyone who watched. Was he staying by choice, or was he simply too deep to escape? For 28 years, Kelly Preston had been John Travolta's anchor. When Jet died, she was the one who held him through the nights when grief made breathing feel impossible. When Scientology controversies raged, she stood beside him, unflinching. When his career stumbled, she reminded him that fame was temporary, but family was forever. She wasn't just his wife. She was his best friend, his co-pilot, the voice that pulled him back from the edge time and time again. Which is why, when she began fighting breast cancer in secret in 2018, she chose to shield him from the full weight of what was coming. Kelly had always been private about personal struggles. Even as she underwent chemotherapy, radiation, and brutal treatments that left her weak and hollow, she maintained the facade of normalcy. She appeared at events, smiling for cameras. She posted cheerful photos on Instagram with the kids. She celebrated John's projects, attended premieres, and never let the world see her suffering. John knew she was sick, but Kelly downplayed the severity, insisting the treatments were working, that she was winning. "I didn't want him to carry another fear," she later told a close friend. He'd already lost so much. So she fought quietly, fiercely, believing love could outlast cancer if she just tried hard enough. But cancer doesn't negotiate, and by early 2020, it became clear the battle was being lost. The COVID-19 pandemic locked the world down in March 2020, trapping families in isolation just as Kelly's condition deteriorated. The Travoltas retreated to their Florida home, a sprawling estate that suddenly felt suffocating. No visitors, no distractions. Just John, Kelly, and their children Ella and Benjamin, watching helplessly as the woman they loved grew thinner, weaker, and more fragile with each passing day. John later described those months as suspended in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. He cooked meals Kelly could barely eat. He read to her when she was too tired to hold a book. He held her hand through pain that morphed her face into expressions he'd never seen. And every night, after she fell into restless sleep, he sat alone in the dark, praying to a God he wasn't sure existed, begging for a mercy he knew wasn't coming. On the morning of July 12, 2020, Kelly Preston died in her bedroom, surrounded by family. She was 57 years old. John didn't release a statement immediately. For 2 days, he sat in silence, unable to form words. When the announcement finally came, it was brief, almost clinical. Kelly's love and life will always be remembered. But those who knew him understood the brevity wasn't coldness. It was the limit of what he could express without shattering completely. Ella, now 20, took to Instagram to mourn publicly. Benjamin, only 9, asked questions that broke John's heart. "Is Mommy with Jet now?" the boy whispered one night. John, tears streaming down his face, could only nod. For the second time in 11 years, John Travolta buried someone he couldn't imagine living without. But this loss carried a cruelty the first hadn't. When Jet died, Kelly had been there to catch him. Now, there was no one. He was alone in a way he'd never been, even during the darkest days of his 1980s career collapse. Friends tried to reach him. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages piled up, unread. He disappeared from public view entirely, not out of choice, but out of necessity. "I didn't know how to be around people," he admitted later. "Every conversation felt like pretending, and I didn't have the strength to pretend anymore." The loneliness was suffocating. The house, once filled with Kelly's laughter and warmth, became a museum of memories. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her perfume lingered in the bathroom. Photographs covered every wall, frozen moments of a life that felt impossibly distant. John would find himself talking to her picture late at night, apologizing for things he couldn't name, asking questions that would never be answered. He threw himself into fatherhood with desperation. Ella and Benjamin became his sole focus, the only reason he forced himself out of bed each morning. He helped with homework, cooked meals, attended virtual school meetings. But even as he went through the motions, those close to the family noticed the hollowness. "He's there physically," one friend said, "but emotionally, he's still standing at Kelly's grave." The grief compounded in ways that felt unbearable. Losing Jet had taught him that life was fragile. Losing Kelly taught him that even survivors eventually run out of strength. He was 66 years old, an age when most people look back on a life well lived. But when John looked back, all he saw were tombstones. The man who had once danced with such joy, who had made millions feel alive through the screen, now moved through his days like a ghost. Saturday Night Fever felt like someone else's memory. Pulp Fiction, a lifetime ago. The roles, the fame, the comebacks. What did any of it matter when the two people he loved most were gone? "I never thought I'd outlive my son," he said in a rare interview months later, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I never imagined facing old age without Kelly. I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore." Hollywood had resurrected John Travolta once, but there are some losses even Hollywood can't bring you back from. While John Travolta's personal life crumbled under the weight of unbearable loss, his professional life mirrored the descent with cruel precision. The 2010s and early 2020s became a graveyard of misfires, direct-to-video disasters, and projects so forgettable that even die-hard fans struggled to name them. After Jet's death in 2009, John tried to lose himself in work, the way he had during the dark days of the 1980s. But grief had dulled his instincts. The scripts he chose felt desperate rather than inspired. Roles accepted not because they excited him, but because staying busy felt better than sitting still with his thoughts. From Paris with Love, in 2010, paired him with Jonathan Rhys-Meyers in a generic action thriller that critics dismissed as loud and empty. It grossed a meager $52 million worldwide against a $52 million budget, a box office wash. The Forger, in 2012, went straight to DVD, barely registering a blip. Killing Season, in 2013, where he played a Serbian war criminal opposite Robert De Niro, earned just $39,881 theatrically in the United States. $39,000. Films that once bore his name and commanded $100 million budgets were now earning less than a suburban car dealership makes in a month. The embarrassments compounded. Gotti, in 2018, a passion project about notorious mob boss John Gotti, became one of the most critically reviled films of the decade. It held a stunning 0% rating on Rotten Tomatoes before a single positive review mercifully pushed it to 12%. Critics called it a disaster, unwatchable, and a film that seems to confuse charisma with shouting. John had fought for years to get the movie made, believing it would be his comeback vehicle. Instead, it became a punchline. Trading Paint in 2019, Speed Kills in 2018, The Poison Rose in 2019, the titles blurred together, interchangeable B-movies that premiered quietly on streaming platforms or in a handful of theaters before vanishing. John, once the youngest Best Actor nominee in Oscar history, was now appearing in films that couldn't secure distribution deals. Friends begged him to be more selective, to wait for the right role, to protect what was left of his legacy. But John seemed almost indifferent to the damage. "I just want to work," he told one concerned colleague. "Sitting at home only makes me think about what I've lost." Cheat. The COVID-19 pandemic briefly paused the descent, but when filming resumed, the pattern continued. In 2024, John appeared in a series of low-budget thrillers and dramas that came and went without fanfare. He was still a name, still recognizable, but no longer a draw. Studios stopped returning calls. A-list directors moved on to younger stars. The roles he was offered, aging mentors, washed-up cops, fathers grieving losses, felt less like characters and more like mirrors. Even his attempt to revive his musical roots fell flat. Grease had celebrated its 40th anniversary in 2018, with special screenings and nostalgic retrospectives. John attended, smiling for cameras, reminiscing about Olivia Newton-John and the magic of 1978. But the event only highlighted how far he'd fallen. Fans lined up to meet the legend he used to be, not the actor he'd become. By 2024, the harsh reality was undeniable. Hollywood had moved on. The industry that resurrected him with Pulp Fiction in 1994 had no interest in resurrecting him again. There were no Tarantinos waiting in the wings this time. No visionary directors willing to bet on a 70-year-old actor whose last genuine hit was over a decade in the past. The fall from Saturday Night Fever to straight-to-streaming obscurity was complete. John Travolta had become what he'd feared most in the 1980s, invisible. Only this time, there would be no comeback. Just the long, quiet fade into irrelevance, broken only by memories of a time when his name could light up the world. In 2025, John Travolta is 71 years old. He lives quietly in his Ocala, Florida estate, a sprawling property complete with 2 private runways where his collection of aircraft sits mostly unused. The man who once flew his own Boeing 707 around the world now rarely climbs into a cockpit. "Flying used to make me feel free," he told a friend recently. "Now it just reminds me of who I used to be." His days follow a routine so rigid it borders on ritual. He wakes early, before the Florida sun fully rises, and spends an hour in silence with coffee, staring at photographs that cover nearly every surface of his home. Kelly smiling on their wedding day. Jet as a toddler, covered in paint from an art project. Ella graduating high school. Benjamin blowing out birthday candles. The house has become a shrine to what was, not what is. Physically, the years have been unkind. Decades of stunts, dancing, and the simple accumulation of time have left him with chronic back pain that flares without warning. He moves more carefully now, the explosive energy that once defined him replaced by the cautious steps of a man aware his body can betray him. His hair, though still dark, looks more like a careful construction than natural growth. Whispers of hair systems and touch-ups persist in tabloids, though John has never addressed them. His weight fluctuates, Stress eating during Kelly's illness added pounds he's never fully shed. Photos from rare public appearances show a softer version of the man who once wore Tony Manero's tight pants with such confidence. He works out sporadically, not with the discipline of his youth, but with the resigned acknowledgement that movement keeps the darkness at bay. But the deepest wounds aren't visible. John struggles with what he describes as fog, days where motivation disappears, where getting out of bed feels like climbing a mountain. He's never publicly acknowledged depression or sought therapy, a silence many attribute to Scientology's anti-psychiatry stance. Instead, he self-medicates with work that doesn't demand much, and isolation that demands nothing at all. His relationship with his children has become his singular focus, though even that carries the weight of loss. Ella Blue, now 24, has pursued acting with moderate success, appearing in small films and desperately trying to establish an identity separate from her father's shadow. John attends her premieres, smiles for photographers, and tells reporters he's so proud. But those close to the family describe a relationship strained by grief neither knows how to discuss. "They love each other," one insider said, "but Jet and Kelly are always in the room with them. Unspoken ghosts neither can escape." Benjamin, now 14, has become John's reason to keep going. The boy looks strikingly like his father, the same dark eyes, the same charming smile. John is fiercely protective of him, keeping him out of the spotlight, homeschooling him to avoid the pressures that come with the Travolta name. They spend afternoons together working on classic cars in John's garage, quiet hours where conversation isn't necessary. "Benjamin doesn't ask about my movies," John said softly in a rare interview. "He just wants me to be his dad. That's all that matters now." Financially, John remains secure. His net worth is estimated at $250 million, built on decades of work and smart investments. The Ocala estate alone is worth over $10 million. He owns properties in California and Maine, though he rarely visits them. His fleet of planes, including a Gulfstream, a Learjet, and the famous Boeing 707 gifted to him by Qantas, represents a fortune in aviation. But wealth, as John has learned too painfully, can't buy back what he's lost. He remains a member of the Church of Scientology, though his involvement has quietly diminished. He attends fewer events, makes fewer public statements of support. Whether this represents doubt, exhaustion, or simply the indifference of a man who's buried too much to care about organizational politics, no one knows. John keeps his spiritual life as private as everything else. Socially, he is almost entirely isolated. Old friends from the industry rarely hear from him. Phone calls go unreturned. Invitations are politely declined. He appears at industry events maybe once or twice a year, smiling for cameras, saying the right things, then disappearing again into the Florida quiet. The parties are over. The applause has faded. The cameras have moved on. What remains is a man sitting alone in a house filled with memories, wondering not how to be famous again, but how to simply be. John Travolta's story is not a Hollywood fairy tale. It's a reminder that fame is fleeting, that triumph can't shield you from tragedy, and that even legends bleed. From the disco floors of Saturday Night Fever to the resurrection of Pulp Fiction, from the heights of global adoration to the depths of unimaginable loss, John has lived 1,000 lives in one. He danced when the world needed joy. He stumbled when the industry turned its back. He rose again when everyone said he was finished. And then life took everything that mattered most. What do we learn from a man who had it all and lost what couldn't be replaced? That success means nothing without the people you love. that grief doesn't discriminate between the famous and the forgotten, that sometimes survival isn't about comeback, it's simply about waking up one more day. John Travolta is no longer the king of Saturday nights. He's a father clinging to his remaining children, a widower haunting rooms that once held laughter, a man who gave the world unforgettable joy while carrying private sorrow no spotlight could ever illuminate. His legacy isn't just the movies or the music. It's the reminder that behind every icon is a human being, fragile and mortal, capable of breaking in ways no audience will ever see. What will you take from John's journey? To cherish your loved ones before it's too late? To understand that fame is temporary, but loss is permanent? Share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more untold stories. And remember, the greatest performances happen not on screen, but in the quiet courage of living after everything falls apart. Because in the end, we're all just dancing in the dark, hoping the music never stops.